We are recording this webinar for folks that aren't able to make it in person. All right. Okay, Edie, you are unmuted. Hopefully everybody can still hear everything okay. Otherwise, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Edie.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. It's been very soggy down here in Oklahoma. I think you guys are getting more snow. We're just getting rain, lots and lots of rain. So just want to say good morning. Remind you, I'm with the Friends National Center. We are the federally funded TA provider for the community-based child abuse prevention funding stream. Most of your organizations receive funding through DHS and PCA Iowa with regards to that money. And so just want to jump on today and continue our conversation that we started last month around programs and evidence-based practice, fidelity, program adherence. So that's where we're going to start today. Just to kind of let you know what we're going to chat about today. We're really going to sort of dive into what program fidelity means. What does that look like? Define it so we're all using the same terms. And then also talk about how outcomes relate to program fidelity and why that's important. And then we're going to spend the last bit of time talking about how to begin measuring program fidelity in your practice with the families you work with. Got some concrete, simple suggestions around how to design a tool if you are implementing a program that doesn't already have a program adherence or program fidelity tool. So we're gonna, dive into that. All right. So just a reminder, this is actually a slide we saw last time, but just wanted to sort of draw the circle and make sure everybody gets the how all of this ties together again. When working with your families and really trying to measure for positive outcomes, there are several components that are need to be present in order to ensure that you're able to demonstrate the achievement of your outcomes. Population needs, which we covered in depth last time, as well as agency capacity. I had some of you request the worksheet that I have around agency capacity, so I hope you found that useful. And then program fidelity, which we just barely brushed the surface on when we talked last time. And so that's the piece for this particular call that we're going to spend the majority of our time. It is an evaluation piece that is critical to really moving forward with implementing programs in the appropriate manner. So program adherence, fidelity, those really are the same thing. Those terms are interchangeable. Typically, you hear about fidelity referred to, program fidelity referred to when you're implementing, in particular, an evidence-based program. And then you might hear program adherence in other contexts. They're really talking about the same thing, and that is whatever that you're doing, that you've implemented it faithful to the core components of the model, and that you implemented it in full as it was intended. These are really crucial pieces. Now, most people, if it's not an evidence-based model, they may be unaware of what the core components are of the program. And I'll just be really honest with you, some evidence-based models don't really have what the core components are. And that's where this gets really important, that we're monitoring for these pieces so we know if we begin to see differences in outcomes, what might be impacting that. So what we're going to talk about today really is that role of fidelity in implementation, and this can be a new implementation, it can be ongoing. It is one of those things that if you've been, trucking along for a little while, implementing the things that you are doing with families, you can absolutely reinstate this piece. Just because it's fallen aside or you haven't been doing program monitoring for Fidelity doesn't mean you can't pick it up in the middle of things. So know that it does not need to be for a new program. And we're going to talk about how all of those things, again, refer to the increased likelihood for positive outcomes. So now, having said that, we are going to jump into program manuals and Fidelity. And again, just want to remind you about these pieces. The program manual is that written set of policies or procedures that really talks about what you're doing. How is it supposed to look? What are all the things that are supposed to happen? And we talked about this briefly last time as well, but it really should pass the Join the Circus test. If all your key staff left tomorrow and joined the circus, could you continue to run your program as planned? And that, frankly, documentation is key to Fidelity. If it's not documented somewhere what you're supposed to be doing and how it's supposed to look, then how do you know if you're deviating from that? So I really encourage you, if that is not something you guys have in place in your programs, to really take a look at that. I shared last time that I had a worksheet to help you get started on that, and I also had some folks request that. That is absolutely still available, so let me know if that's something you need. Because as we move into this Fidelity piece, you'll understand how having things documented about what and how it's supposed to look is really crucial to knowing whether or not you're in fact achieving those goals. And in addition to just being able to monitor your program and make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, it really does permit sustainability and replicability within your program. It allows you to ensure that 6 months from now you're going to be doing the same things you're doing now. 6 years from now, if it's still appropriate, that you're going to be doing the same things. And those are big components that need to be thought of to make sure that you are meeting the needs of your families that you're serving. And I was looking, it looked like we had a chat. Oh, is the audio breaking up?
I'm hearing okay, Edie.
Okay, all right, then I'm gonna apologize to the one person who's having trouble, and maybe they can switch to their phone line and have more consistent audio. So my apologies there. So yeah, the Fidelity piece and having the documentation in place to really be able to examine that will be important. And you'll see here in a minute, we're going to go through the components of what a program adherence or Fidelity monitoring tool might look like. And you'll see why having that stuff in writing and documented would be important to that. So I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about implementation because you really can't talk about Fidelity or program adherence without it. And just feel like it's a really crucial step. Now, many of you may be thinking, I'm already implementing. How is this relevant? And it is relevant in that just because you're already doing something and maybe you're not practicing in the best way you could, maybe you are. That's awesome. This is going to be reinforcing for you. But if you're not, this is going to really highlight what you could be doing in terms of doing things a little bit differently. And so knowing what implementation science says about best practice, I think is important to ensure that you're doing the right steps. You can go back and do some things if you haven't done them already. So I'm not clicking forward all of a sudden. Just a second. Oh, there we go. Okay. So when we start talking about implementation, it's really important to understand that everybody sort of has their own path to implementation. And this is going to be true even within your own agency. Say, for example, right now you are practicing in let me think if I can think of an Iowa county, DeKalb County, I think that's one of your counties. But you really want to expand to Polk County too. I think that's another one of your counties. And so what you did in DeKalb may not look like what it looks like in Poe, right? And so there's not this one size fits all, but if you're following a plan and you have in mind what it's supposed to look like, it's going to increase the likelihood that you are implementing with fidelity, or at least if you're adapting things, you know what you're adapting and how they might impact. So it really is important to have that in mind as you're thinking about the work that you're doing. And it's also important to know that when folks begin programs, it is almost always done without fidelity. That's really important to know. It's not a good thing. It's not something we should be proud of necessarily, but it is true. Almost nothing is implemented as it was intended originally. And that's why really monitoring for that, looking for what you're doing and how you're doing it, what changes you might have made in response to your target population or resources or whatever the case may be, is important to know. And then even if you do sort of start out of the gate really strong, doing it as it was intended, it oftentimes has drift over time. That happens with staffing changes and especially staff turnover. And that's probably the biggest thing that we see. You might start something new and it's bright and shiny and everybody's trained the same way and everybody's going through the experience the same. And then you're a few months in and maybe you lose a staff member and you do a pretty good job of getting them through the same training. Maybe not quite as much, but pretty close. And then a year goes on and you lose another staff member and everybody's sort of forgotten exactly what it looked like when everybody got trained in the beginning. So you just kind of put that person in there and maybe they shadow somebody for a little bit or do some things, but it's not the same training. And that's really typical. And so that's where some of these pieces can be really important. Things might have gone along swimmingly for a year or two, and then all of a sudden you start seeing problems with your outcomes. And if you're not doing this program adherence piece, that's where you can't answer some of the questions around why are things changing within my program. Is it your target population has changed, or is it maybe you're just not implementing the same program anymore? So those are really important pieces. I'm going to stop here for just a second before we jump into a more concrete conversation about what I mean by adaptation, and just make sure nobody has any questions at this point or things that they want me to cover. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or to type it in the chat box. All right, I am not seeing or hearing anything going on, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Again, remember, you can always interrupt me. So let's talk about adaptation. Now, adaptation is really sort of specific to evidence-based models, most people believe. But in fact, that's not really 100% true. Because fidelity and adaptation go hand in hand, and when you're talking about implementing anything, whether it's well researched and you know exactly what it is, versus something you've put together and there's a group of components that you believe need to go together to make your outcomes successful for families, whatever the case may be, if you choose not to implement all of those pieces as you had originally intended, then you have done an adaptation. And so really understanding where you can adapt, where you can maybe change things versus where you can't is really a key to knowing like what are the core components. And I sort of shared earlier that some evidence-based models will have their core components identified, but frankly some don't. If you talk to some developers and say, hey, we want to do this, but we need to change X. They may or may not know if changing X is going to impact your outcomes that you're likely to see with that program. And so having those conversations with the people that designed the evidence-based model is really important. It's crucial, even if they tell you we can't answer that, because that tells you the kinds of things you need to be monitoring for if, in fact, you decide to go ahead and change that. So just be aware. But it's also important in that if you are implementing something that isn't, a take-off-the-shelf evidence-based model, if you begin to change things away from your original design, have you changed something so much that may ultimately impact whether or not you're successful? And that's a key. And that's how you begin to define what those core components are. So core components are the key services or activities that have been demonstrated or are believed based on the program theory that you're utilizing to lead to the identified outcomes. And so we're going to dive a little bit more into that. What does that sort of look like and mean? But really it's those things that you believe make up your program. Now, some programs, it is everything you do, and it's very prescribed. Other programs, it is just the dosage or the particular curriculum that maybe the environment in which the curriculum is implemented doesn't matter. Or sometimes it is the fact that you share information and people have the chance to go home and practice it in between doses, so that you couldn't consolidate and give them all the information in one day. It's those kinds of things. So really being aware around what the model should look like is incredibly important. And adaptation, this is just a bunch of fancy words for what does adaptation mean? It means you're changing something, right? And ideally, if you're doing it within your practice, that you're doing something, you're changing it to fit a need. Please, please, please don't adapt without some purpose in mind. And hopefully it's a good purpose. And so just really being aware that those changes may impact your outcomes, I think is incredibly important to the work that you do. So what do I mean by adaptation? So there's a point at which you adapt something so much that you become an innovation and not an adaptation. So what does that mean? That means if you have changed something that is considered a core component in form, that you are no longer implementing what you said you were going to implement. An example of that would be there's the Safe Home curriculum. It's a 12-week curriculum. It is intended to be implemented over 12 weeks, and that folks go home and practice some of the knowledge shared in between. What we know based on the research is that you cannot change that to a weekend. So instead of doing 6 or 12 one-week classes, you can do 2 6-day on a Saturday and Sunday. What they saw was that sort of fell apart. They did not see the same outcomes, and it was because they changed the function of the education sharing. It really was about going home, practicing, working a little bit with it, coming back, debriefing about it on the next session, and then diving into new content. So understanding those pieces, I think, is just incredibly crucial. And you've got to be aware that if you change form, that's okay. You cannot change function. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, for example, you're doing a curriculum that brings families together for support groups. And the original model had families being provided with best tokens so that they could get to groups free of charge. So say you're in a fairly rural community and you don't have bus service, but this is a program you really want to do, and transportation is an issue for the families you work with. So say you go with taxi vouchers as opposed to bus tokens. So you've changed the form of the program, but you have not changed the function because you're still providing free transportation. Does that make sense? Now, so let me give you an example of where that line might begin to get a little blurry. Say you want to reimburse families for something that was originally provided. For example, in an original model, the parent support group provided childcare on site free of charge for the families to participate. Your organization doesn't have the capacity or the facility to offer the free on-site childcare during group. So what you decide to do is make an arrangement with a drop-in childcare that's close to your office that allows the families to drop the children in. They have to initially pay the fee, but they'll go to the class, they get a voucher, and when they go back, they'll get reimbursed their money. So is that a change of form or a change of function? That one is one that gets much more blurry, because by having them have to pay some money up front, basically to prove that they're going to the class and then coming back and maybe getting their money back, that may change things significantly. Maybe they don't even have, the 20 to hand to them, for the 2 hours while they're at the class. So that may be a change of function, but we wouldn't know unless we were able to monitor for that. Did this hinder participation? Was this difficult? How did that look? So that's sort of an example of what I mean of form versus function. And really, this form versus function piece is incredibly crucial, because that is what tells you, can I change something? Can I make this look differently to fit the needs of my program, my families, my environment, whatever the case may be? So I'm going to pause here. Sorry, my allergies are going crazy. But I'm going to pause here and just sort of see if anybody has any questions about this initial piece of sort of the form versus function. Okay, not seeing or hearing anything come up. So knowing what those pieces are of your program that need to be implemented is the key here to understanding whether you've changed form or function, right? And so that's where that program documentation can become really crucial. Now, the purveyors of implementation science that really work in depth with programs will tell you you should never adapt anything at the beginning. That you should always implement in full as it was intended and see what works and what doesn't work, and then make adaptations. What we know is that almost never happens, is that pretty much everybody makes some changes to their program. So in all likelihood, you guys aren't implementing something new right at the moment. But what you need to do is really take that long, hard look at your program. What are you doing? Does it currently look like it's supposed to look? If not, why? What was the reason that necessitated that change? Do you believe it was a change in form or function? And really just becoming super aware of those pieces and documenting that is going to be a crucial step at this point. Oh, what is this? Oh, sorry. I thought I took out all this animation stuff. So program adherence and fidelity are one and the same. They're important to all programs, and I can't stress that enough. Some of you might be implementing things that are not evidence-based programs. You're thinking, this isn't relevant to me at all. I can't tell you how relevant it is to you. It really does make a huge difference in the work that you do. if you are conscious of this and participating in program adherence or fidelity monitoring, because it really is the only way you're going to know the answer to this question right here. If you're trucking along and things are going swimmingly for a while, and like I said, maybe you've been implementing for about a year, you've been seeing really good outcomes, but then all of a sudden you start to see some issues. Maybe you're not seeing the same movement on outcomes that you saw before, or maybe things have really kind of taken a turn, and you're trying to understand your data. The only way you can answer the question about whether or not you have an effectiveness problem or an implementation problem is if you are doing this program adherence fidelity monitoring piece. It's the only way. Because if you're having low fidelity and poor outcomes, you probably have an implementation problem. You need to regroup, take that step back, and go back to the practice in the way you were doing it before. You need to be super conscious about that and move forward with it. If you are monitoring for fidelity and you're still seeing, and so you have high fidelity, high program adherence, but you're seeing poor outcomes, then now you have an effectiveness problem. Maybe your target population has shifted so that what you had been offering is no longer what it was that you need to be offering your families anymore. And you take that step back and evaluate the outcomes, the programs, the services piece. The only way you know the answer to that particular question is if, in fact, you have answered or can answer whether or not you have an implementation or an effectiveness problem. And the only way to do that is through program monitoring. So let's talk about well-developed fidelity measures. Fidelity measures seem overwhelming to folks. You might be lucky, you might be implementing a model that had a program adherence or fidelity measurement tool that came with it. But in all likelihood, you don't. And so really understanding how to begin to put that together can be super crucial to being successful in this part. The tools to assess whether or not your implementation is going as described really take a look at some different components. But they also accomplish some pretty big goals. First off, they can discriminate between the evidence-based and the other practices. So what do I mean by that? Well, a well-developed measure can help you determine sort of what those core components are. So for example, you've got a tool and it goes along and it's measuring, like for example, what I had said before, the childcare piece and the fact that they're having to pay up front. So that does not seem to impact your outcomes at all. Families don't report any issues with that. It seems to be going along well, and you're seeing your outcomes as you believed they would be. The reality is that means that now that piece of the program, the child care and the prepayment, is not a core component of the program. But the only way you can answer that is because you had that in your in your program monitoring tool. So it really begins to help you narrow down what are those components that are crucial to the success of your families. So we've already talked about how this would be correlated with better outcomes. If you're monitoring for fidelity or program adherence, in all likelihood, you are going to see less program drift. So why is that? Because you're monitoring for program drift. So for example, you did bring on that staff a year and a half later, and maybe they didn't get the same training that everybody else had gotten. Maybe you begin to see some problems with that. Well, but you're in your program monitoring phase, and you identify that as a part of the piece, and you can then regroup and solve your issue before you get too far down the road and the program's drifted too far. It also helps you interpret your findings. Like I said, it helps you answer that implementation versus effectiveness piece. So, for example, if you do begin to see your outcomes tell a different story than they did 6 months, 12 months, 2 years ago, you have some additional information. Well, we're still doing the same thing that we've always done in the same way. So that really tells us we need to take a step back. Let's look at our target population. Let's re-examine needs. What has changed in our community that maybe is seeing this as no longer the same need? And that monitoring fidelity piece is crucial in that particular respect. It also helps in implementation. Staffing changes happen. We know they do. And if everybody's using this same guide, this same, highlighted piece for how we do our practice, then I can't tell you how crucial it is to do this, because that's going to help you continue to see the same results with the families over and over, and help moving things along in the right dimension. So I'm now going to begin to share with you a sample fidelity measure. This is a really great tool. It's pretty simple. It's actually this particular tool was developed several years ago now, actually out of an initiative for California Healthy Kids. And it includes fidelity guidelines and checklists for their programming. And the thing I love about this tool is because it feels doable. And so we're going to break down sort of the components of it, and we're going to really examine how they put this together, and how you might begin to do the same thing within your program, because most of you don't have one of your own. So before I sort of jump into this, does anybody have any questions so far about the fidelity piece and what that looks like? All right, well, you guys are a quiet bunch. Not even any chat questions so far today. I'm going to assume it's not because you haven't had your caffeine yet, but it's because everything's just going swimmingly, right? So, all right, so let's really sort of begin to dive into. I'm going to actually take you page by page through their checklist and guidelines to really break it down for you. So this is the cover page, just says what it is, no big deal. Excuse me. So I think that it's really incredible that they put in these guidelines into the beginning of their tool. Now, why is that? Why do I think that that's a crucial piece? It's because it helps remind folks, this is why this stuff is here. This is why we think it's important. And it helps draw everyone back to the principles, the pieces that they feel make their program effective and why they do what they do. So, here they just have a statement of what the guidelines and checklists are. It helps talk about, why they do what they do, why it should be implemented in the manner consistent. And you'll see they talk about that they have 7 key dimensions, and that those key dimensions are what were indicated that when a program was implemented, it demonstrated their effectiveness. It talks about what those are, and it also gives a reference to the research. Again, I think that's really important, because helping folks understand that background, those assumptions on which your program are based, even if it's not an evidence-based program that you pulled off the shelf. What are the reasons you believe what you're doing will be effective with families. And I think that the more we can share that information with our staff, that there's a reason we do what we do, and the way that we do it will help with the fidelity pieces. It will avoid program drift. Okay, so here is where they begin to break it down. And you'll notice here on this first page, there's 3 categories. First off, delivery. They talk about what instructional strategies were employed in the research that just demonstrated the effects. And so they use these following instructional strategies. Again, reminding folks, this is what you should be doing. You should be doing skills modeling. You should be doing coaching and cueing, storytelling, group discussion, and role playing. Again, a reminder, these are the pieces that we feel like need to be in place. You know, think for a moment about the program that you do. What are the strategies? What is the delivery method of the services that you offer? And I'm going to pause for a minute or so, and I want you to really think about that. What are those pieces that you would have in delivery of your program or services? And I want you to jot those down. Give you another 30 seconds or so. What are those key components? What are those things that are important to your program in terms of delivery? All right, so keep those notes. And now let's talk about dosage. You'll notice here they talk about the number. Oh, just a second before I dive into that. It looks like there was a question. I want to, before I move on. Sorry, guys. Take it a moment. Oh, okay. Delma, can you hear now? Are you good?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Wonderful. So let's talk about dosage. Think about those things that comprise your program. For second step, they really talk about the pieces they need here. So what are those? In second and third grade, they have sequential lessons that are organized into 3 units. So empathy training, impulse control, problem solving, anger management. So what that says is that those lessons have to be done in order: empathy training, impulse control, problem solving, anger management. That each lesson is approximately 35 minutes, and that they should be implemented once or twice a week over the 16 to 20 week period. So the things that they need to be really monitoring for are around: are they doing those in order? Are the session lengths in fact 35 minutes? And are they being implemented over the 16 to 20 week period in the appropriate 1 to 2 week, twice a week dosage? So now think about your program. What are the things that you do? Maybe you have a curriculum and it says you need to do X, Y, Z. Maybe you don't. Maybe you have particular things that you implement with families in a particular order. Or maybe you believe the order doesn't matter. But again, I want you to sit here and think about what is the things that we do, and maybe what is the number, length, frequency, that applies to my families and the work that I can do. So again, I'm going to just pause for a moment. I'm going to have you take a look at that and begin to sort of jot that down. What are those dosage components for your program? What are those pieces that you need to have happen? Do you have a particular number of sessions that's recommended for families to participate in? What is the length of those look like? Is it a support group? It's a home visit? Is it, one-on-one sessions with a parenting coach? What do those things look like? Give you another 30 seconds or so to finish jotting down your notes. Okay, excellent. So now let's talk about setting. Setting for some are incredibly important, and for others not so much. For second step here, you'll notice that their setting is pretty straightforward. It's intended to be implemented in the classrooms. And since they're dealing with second and third graders, specifically elementary school classrooms. So what is the setting that you provide your services in? Is it in-home? Is it in-center? Does it matter? Maybe it can be done just as easily in a park. Talking with a family. Think about that. What piece is ideal for the setting for you in the implementation of your program? Or does setting matter? Give you another, just this one tends to be the easier one out of the group, so I'm going to just give you a few more seconds on this one. Okay, so now let's go. These are, remember at the beginning, they talked about 7 components, right? So we've already covered the first 3. Now we're going to talk about the next 4. This is the second page. Actually, I think technically it's the third page because they have the cover sheet. But anyway, it talks about the next piece here is about materials. What is it that you use in the work that you do that really guides the work? Do you have a curriculum? Was it written by an outside entity? Maybe it's a curriculum you guys wrote yourselves. Maybe it's not a curriculum, but it's a set of concept or ideas that should be covered with the families. Maybe it is really just about letting the family self-identify and then identifying materials appropriate to the family's needs. What are those pieces that you believe are what is crucial to offering the services? What are those materials? As you begin to think about this, you'll also note here, interestingly enough, they talk about the materials being second edition versus third edition. And I like what they do here because they highlight what the differences are between the second and third. So that if folks maybe haven't integrated into the third edition yet, they know what they're missing or they know what the differences might be in their evaluation of second edition to third edition. All right, now that you've spent a little bit of time talking or thinking about materials, let's talk about the target population. And you'll notice that I've mentioned target population several times throughout our conversation, both the first time we were together last month, as well as today. And that's because your target population is really important. And it's important because if you don't know who you're serving, it can really impact your outcomes. Like, for example, when I talked earlier about, maybe you've been going along, you've been seeing a particular result on your outcomes, and then all of a sudden you begin to see a drift. One of those pieces that might drift is your target population. Maybe the community that you're serving is changing, and whereas it used to be younger, single parent families, maybe now you're seeing an influx of a little bit older two-parent households, and their needs are different than what you'd seen before. That's where target population can be so important with regards to doing a program monitoring fidelity piece, because it can be crucial and can really impact your outcomes. But if you're not really paying attention to what was going on there, it can make a difference. Now, for example, here with second step, it can be, fairly wide open in terms of the target population they believe they're serving. Here, it's all the students basically in second and third grade, and they anticipate that they're going to have a diverse range of backgrounds as well as race or ethnicity within their communities that they're serving. So really understanding those pieces is I think incredibly important. Do you think that your target population is going to make a difference? Do you believe that perhaps a particular race or ethnicity of your group and a change there might change your outcomes? What about socioeconomic backgrounds? If things, markers, housing, income, either go up or down, are those going to make a difference? So I want you to just take a moment and document those crucial things that you believe are present in your population that you serve and that make a difference in the outcomes you see. Give you guys just a few more moments to document target population. Good deal. So now let's talk about provider qualifications, right? What does your staff look like? What do they need to look like to implement this? And this can be super important. Like for example, here with Second Step, all they believe that they qualifications is that they're just an elementary school teacher. I shouldn't say just an elementary school teacher. I think that's an incredibly difficult job at this point. Can pay me, I think, to do that. That's what they believe their qualification is. How about for you? An example of that might be if you're implementing nurse-family partnership. They need registered nurses. So that's a qualification. Under the guidelines for nurse-family partnership, it can't be an LPN. It must be an RN. So that's an incredibly important qualification. So really thinking about, are there any credentials or qualifications that you need? Say, for example, maybe you require your home visitors to have a bachelor's degree in social work. That would be a provider qualification. But it can also be less concrete, right? Maybe it's not about some certificate or degree that they've earned, but really how they're able to interact with the world. An example there might be you need to have somebody bilingual, that you have a high Hispanic population that you're serving. And so that's a qualification for your particular providers. Maybe it's that they are comfortable in group settings because they're going to be a group leader. Maybe it's that they have access to reliable transportation because they're driving all over the place to go to various home visits. That kind of thing. Maybe they need to have a certain level of expertise with regards to technology because when they're on site, they use tablets to provide interaction and the curriculum to the family. And they've got to be able to use that technology effectively so that the technology supplements the environment and doesn't take away from it. So take a moment and think about those things. What are those qualifications that you believe are crucial to the work that you do? I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to think through this one because it can be rather diverse. All right, I'll give you about another 30 seconds. Okay, and now finally, the last piece on this page is about training. What is the nature and length of the training required to provide this particular service? You'll see for a second step, it's pretty straightforward. They want the elementary school teachers to have been participated in a 2-day training that's conducted by instructors from the Committee for Children. Pretty simple, straightforward. Yours may be more complicated. It may require in-person training as well as maybe some on-the-job training. Maybe you need some job shadowing to feel like folks are completely trained. Maybe there needs to be modeling or coaching going on. So really think about that. What is the nature of the training that you provide your providers or should provide that allows them to offer your program effectively? All right, just about 30 more seconds. Have you write down those training components. Okay, so now thinking about all of these things that you've put into these 7 categories, is there anything else that you can think of that maybe is crucial to offering your program? Is there a resource of some sort? Is there something else that you feel like we have not touched on yet that is really key to the work that you do? And if there is, I want you to now write that piece down. In general, these 7 categories usually capture the majority of those things, but sometimes there is another piece, and so I want you to take that moment now to think about that. Is there anything in the work that you do that you feel like you haven't captured yet? Okay, so now I'm going to actually show you their actual checklist. This is the piece that they use to now monitor for all of those things that you've been writing down. And so that's where I wanted you to, begin to see. They took, those strategies, the skills modeling, coaching, the cueing, the storytelling, the group discussion, and they've really turned these into simple yes or no items. For you, you might not feel like yes or no captures what you need to. Maybe you need an additional category. Maybe you need to add in sort of sub pieces there. Maybe you want them to, check off by each of those strategies. For example, that they did in fact see, the modeling, the coaching, the storytelling. Maybe you only saw a couple of those components and you want to monitor for that. But you can see how they begin to break this information down. And that's where now I want your mind to begin to go. So for example, in delivery, those items that you said were crucial strategies in implementing your program. How might you begin to document those? Can you do a simple yes, no? In addition here, you'll see that they said not only should they use, the classroom observation logs or the provider self-report logs, which clearly their folks are filling out, ideally. You'll see maybe that there's other pieces, like for example, they have the completion record, the emotional learning checklist. What are those documentation pieces that you can pull? Or will it be, just standard observation? Did I see these things happening? So for this first step of strategies, I want you to begin to think about that. Are there existing data points where you could already pull this information from, or is this new information you would need to collect? And if so, what that might look like. My hope is that today, before our time is up here in a few minutes, that you've really begun an earnest step in beginning to design this for your program. So that's what this effort is all about. Take a few more moments to jot down those places where you could get this information from existing data points, or some thoughts about if you do need to collect it new. Okay, now let's talk about dosage. Again, they are talking about how it's supposed to happen, what it's supposed to look like, and did it happen in that way. They've again said that the classroom observation logs, as well as the provider software support report logs, are those pieces that you need in order to make that happen. Are there things maybe that you identified in the delivery step for documentation that could be used for dosage? Maybe there are other pieces there as well. So take a moment, think about those, and where could you get information about dosage that would help inform your work. I think anytime you can use existing documentation that overlaps is, of course, awesome. It reduces the burden, but that's not always appropriate. And here for the next one, you'll see that they talk about setting, and is it being implemented in the classrooms? That one's pretty straightforward. You know, they're just wanting a documentation of which schools it's being implemented in. For you, is this more or less complicated? Do you need to be monitoring for setting? Do you feel like that is crucial? And if so, what might that look like? And maybe it is that you have a variety of settings going and you want to monitor for that. For example, some families are seen in their home and some come into the center. Perhaps monitoring for that and seeing a difference in outcomes between those families might be important to understand how that setting, how that environment might impact your outcomes. There's an example of the type of thing you may want to look at in this particular place. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I was trying to get to the mute button and I didn't make it in time. All right, now let's look at materials. Again, what are those materials that you need to implement your program? Are they being used? And I think that are they being used piece can be very important, because that's one of the places you might begin to see drift, is that, you know, providers feel like that they have the curriculum memorized enough that maybe they don't use the program manual anymore. That may or may not be a good thing, because maybe their memory doesn't serve them properly. Maybe they begin to talk about a particular item in a way that's much different than it was in the manual, because they've, you know, sort of adapted it over time in their head. Maybe they're not referring back to the checklist, and so they're consistently missing one particular item that they should be sharing with family, as you know, in session 3. It's that kind of thing. So really thinking about how you can do that, how do you document that, how much you understand whether or not your folks are using the materials as they were intended. And now target population. You know, are you beginning to see things, clients differently? In all likelihood, you're collecting your demographic data somewhere. And so what are those records that you can go ahead and pull from that can give you this information? It's not that, you know, you necessarily need to be collecting it new, although maybe you discover that as you dive deeper into your demographic information, you're not answering one key question. Maybe you don't know about the employment status of your families, and you feel like that might be a crucial component. So maybe that's something you need to add in to your already existing demographic collection, thinking about those pieces. Give you a moment to jot down thoughts around data sources for that. Again, this one probably is one that you easily have access to. And now provider qualifications. What is it? Where can you get the documentation about who is providing your services? You know, in all likelihood, that's already, you know, present in employment records or whatever. You know, really making sure you take a look at that. You know, have folks, you know, maybe got hired in with a bachelor's level and shifted, gotten a master's in the meantime. And are you seeing a different level of outcomes based on that level of training? Perhaps it's just that technology piece that I referred to earlier. Is there a way that you can collect data on that and know that maybe the difference you're seeing with providers is because one of them is more savvy with the tablet than the other, and the technology gets in the way in some sessions. So really beginning to think about those qualifications that you identified and how you can track the data for that. What are those existing data sources there that are already present, and is there anything new that maybe you need to figure out how to collect? And then finally, the training. Are folks being trained in the same way consistently over time? And how do you document that? Do you have, you know, regular, ongoing, continuing education opportunities? Do you revisit the provider training, you know, annually within your staff meeting? What do you do if somebody misses that training in order to ensure that they're getting the same level of training as everyone else? What are those pieces in your existing documentation that you can find? All right, so now hopefully within your notes, you really have the beginnings of a program adherence or program monitoring tool that you begin to really think about those core components and what they might look like. As we've kind of talked about, some common components to those pieces are around adherence, our dosage and exposure, quality of program and delivery, training, as well as other pieces. We talked about some of these collection methods, whether it's direct observation, practitioner self-report. Maybe it's also the evaluation pieces that you're getting from actual consumers. What are they reporting? What are you collecting or documenting through that piece? And really thinking about how do you begin to gather that all together. So my hope is that you've got sort of the bones of an outline there for you to really pull this piece through so that you can begin to do program adherence and fidelity monitoring within your organization. It's one of those things that especially if you're designing it on your own, you're going to need to pay attention. Are you asking the questions the right way? Take a look at the data. If you're not seeing what you think you should, is it because you're not collecting the right information? What are those pieces? So I'm now going to just stop and see if there are any questions about the content that we covered today. We went through it pretty quickly, and this is a fairly meaty topic. And absolutely, you can get a copy of the checklist. I can actually send the PDF version of that actual checklist, as well as they can share the slides from today too, but I can definitely send a copy of the checklist out to folks. Any thoughts? Does anybody feel like at this point that fidelity monitoring is something that feels much more doable now than maybe it did an hour ago? Gosh, you're a quiet group this morning. So, excellent. Okay, well, please feel free. Again, I'll show my email address in that here in a bit. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. Hopefully, you are able to take this information that was provided today and really begin to look at how you can implement this within your own organization. I think it is incredibly informative to have this sort of information at your fingertips as you're looking through your outcomes and your evaluation pieces. And we now want to talk about, we have some time scheduled for for May 14th, I think is what we tentatively have scheduled. And what we really want to hear from you guys at this point is, what are those components? What are those pieces that you feel like we can provide support around? What is other content or information that you need? That may not be a question that you can necessarily answer today, but if you know of something, awesome. Please bring that up for us. If as you're diving into this, you discover that there are things you would like to know more about. Perhaps you are looking at trying to implement something new, and you really want some guidance around selecting evidence-based or evidence-informed models. How do you find out the research, what's out there? Maybe you need more help in logic models, taking a look at those and helping to document your programs in that way. Maybe you just need some time to talk with each other around, some of the challenges that you're seeing. But really, please share with myself or with Abby or Julie what those needs are for ongoing support. Is there other content that would be helpful for us to cover? And so there, again, is my email address as well as my phone number. Just a reminder that it's easier to reach me over email. I do travel a fair amount for my work and can always answer emails from the road, whereas I can't necessarily always take calls. So Abby, that's the end of what I have today. It looks like we are about, I don't know, 10, 12 minutes early. So just, making sure nobody has any questions. I'm happy to stay on the line for a few more minutes. If people do want to chat or ask questions, and, folks that are done are welcome to log off, just whatever makes sense there. Did we lose Abby? All right, well, I'm not sure what has happened with Abby. Like I said, I'm happy to hang out for the next few minutes. If you have questions or you want to unmute and talk with me, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I think we are done. And thank you for the time we spent together today. I appreciate your participation.